So let's talk about Peter. Peter was one of Jesus' disciples. He wasn't a theologian. He was a fisherman. He made his living in storms, shouting over people, aggressive leadership. And when Jesus said, "Follow me," he didn't form a committee. He didn't think about it. He just boldly went with him. So Peter was a bold leader type, the kind that jumps in first but doesn't necessarily finish strong. In Matthew 26:33-35, this is just before the betrayal of Jesus. In verse 33, Peter answered him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." Bold, but not necessarily showing a lot of self-awareness. Then we go to Luke 22:59-62. So this is after Jesus has been betrayed. There's chaos going on. And so we pick it up the story and we say, "And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, 'Certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean.'" And they're talking about Peter. But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately, while he was speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to me, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny him 3 times. And he went out and bitterly wept. At that point, that was the 3rd time he had denied him. But fortunately for us, Peter was redeemed and restored. So when they finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." And he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." And then he said to them the 3rd time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." So each of these mirrors the 3 denials from when Jesus was betrayed. And another point I'd make is that this whole thing about what's his name, Simon, Peter. So when Jesus met Simon, he actually called him Cephas, which means rock. The translation we use is Peter, which is Petros in Greek, but that means rock. And so what you can see here is this is St. Peter's Basilica because Jesus said that Peter would be the rock on which he builds his church. So you go from someone who boasts he'll never betray Jesus, to betraying Jesus 3 times, to answering Jesus 3 times that he loves him, to building the church. So what frame are we talking about right now? So right now we're talking about a frame called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, which was identified in 1999 by a couple of people named, obviously, David Dunning and Justin Kruger. They were at Cornell. And they did this study called Unskilled and Unaware of It. And so the core concept, as you can see here, is that basically think of this knowledge almost as a timeline, as our knowledge grows over time, right? The beginning of this class, the beginning of school, the beginning of your graduate programs, whatever, that's the beginning. And we all start in the same place, this initial ignorance. And then an interesting thing happens is our confidence shoots up when we learn just the vaguest amount of it, right? So think about if anybody's taken their first college level psychology course, you want to run out of the first day thinking you know everything about psychology. And obviously there are people who spend years studying psychology to get their doctorates in psychology or their master's in psychology to actually practice psychology. But for some reason, when everybody takes their first class of psychology, they think they understand everything about psychology. So you get to that peak of Mount Stupid, but as you learn more, we get into this valley of despair, where we realize we don't know anything. And this, to be honest, is a big part of, if any of you guys move on to higher degrees, move on to PhDs, this is a big part of the PhD journey. Because you think you know a topic, you start like, yeah, I'm going to do my PhD in this, I obviously know it. And as soon as you start researching, you realize you have no idea how much is out there. And all you know is everything you don't know. But then the good news is, as we continue to grow our knowledge, we hit this slope of enlightenment, and then we get to what Dunning and Kruger call the plateau of sustainability, right? And this is the same thing Peter did, right? So Peter, initially ignorant, didn't know Jesus, knows Jesus a little bit, gets to the peak of Mount Stupid and says, I'll never deny you. gets in the valley of despair, denies him 3 times, comes back, is redeemed by Christ saying, do you love me 3 times, and finally ends the plateau of sustainability where he goes on to preach more and to develop the church. So let's give some more practical examples of this. All right, some quiz. Does anybody know who this is?
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs, nailed it. This is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was the co-founder of Apple in 1976, the year before I was born, by the way, with his partner Steve Wozniak. Known for his brilliance, intensity, perfectionism, helped revolutionize personal computing, digital music. Initially celebrated as a genius entrepreneur, but clashed with his colleagues, and returned in 1997 to transform Apple into one of the most valuable companies. He has such interesting quirks. I read a great biography on Steve Jobs. If you guys, anybody looks at their phones or any icons, if you got an iPhone, you notice the rounded corners. He insisted on that. That was one of his biggest things that actually had to do. Another couple of interesting things is you see how small this phone was. He was very adamant that the phone should fit in the hand and only be able to use with your thumb. And obviously you see now we've gotten much bigger. He also said never would he ever want a stylus or anything like that. And iPads now have styluses. It was very interesting to see how much influence he had in the design early on. All right, what about this guy?
Bob Ross.
Bob Ross, okay. All right, that's a really old reference. I'm glad somebody knows it. Bob Ross, who is he? He was an American painter, art instructor, and television host, creator of The Joy of Painting, known for his calm voice. He always said happy little trees. If you've ever seen any of his videos or anything like that, it's worth checking out. He served 20 years in the Air Force, where he was known for being strict, loud, and demanding. After leaving the military, he vowed to never raise his voice again. And he developed a unique wet-on-wet oil painting technique that made art accessible and approachable to millions. I remember my dad used to paint to him. It was pretty interesting. All right, 2 real examples. This is a not so real example. Does anybody know who this is? The actor is Tim Robbins. In this, he was playing a character named Andy Dufresne. So if any of you have not seen Shawshank Redemption, shame on you. But there are some mild spoilers here. It will not ruin the movie, though. Absolutely go and see this movie. All right, Andy Dufresne. And this is one of the movies where if you ask anybody, just name their favorite movie, there's a lot of people over, say, the age 35 that will say The Shawshank Redemption. So he was the protagonist, based on Stephen King's novel. It was a little short book. He was a banker, wrongly convicted of murdering his wife and her lover, sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms at the Shawshank prison. He seems mild and reserved at first, but he's really intelligent, strategic, and resilient. And over 20 years in jail, uses patient intellect and quiet faith to not only transform the prison, but eventually get out. So all 3 of these guys have a very similar journey as Peter did. Not quite to the degree that Peter did, but if you think about it, Steve Jobs, early Apple years, brilliant but arrogant. There's an interesting part in his book where at one of the board meetings, they were having screaming matches. And I I've seen board meetings and I've never seen screaming matches, but that much passion this guy had about everything he did. And back to the point about designs, like he said, this is how it's going to be designed, and he knew the answer and that was it. But then he got kicked out in 1985 and he looked like a public failure. He built Next, which is an interesting story, but Next was a failure. But then he took that money and he bought Pixar. And Pixar, wildly successful. Think about all the if we think of I hate to put it this way, but like more of the classic Pixar films, the Toy Stories, The Incredibles, Cars, Finding Nemo. Frankly, the movies that I watched with my son when he was that age, that was all early Pixar, and that was all with Steve Jobs, not as the creative, but as one of the owners, or as the owner. And that was his slope of enlightenment. He's learning how to tell stories, how to be collaborative, how to work with creatives. And then in 1997, he returned to Apple and led Apple to the wild behemoth that it is today. Similarly, Bob Ross, when he was in the Air Force, he was a sergeant. He commanded with volume and control. He thought he knew what was going on. He led aggressively. But when he left the military, he realized that aggression sometimes makes things worse. It really resonates with me because I did a lot of the same things when I left the Army, when I was very tough on my kids. And I realized like that's not really working for me. And fortunately, I was able to get past some of those terrible leadership traits. And it also doesn't work in the corporate world, right? You can't just tell people to do this or else. You have to bring people along on the journey. And Bob Ross realized that. And so then he began teaching art with humility, developed that gentle, invitational teaching style. And to this day, he's still leading people. You can still find his shows on YouTube that people watch, even though he's long passed. And then Andy Dufresne arrives at Shawshank. He's sure that the system will work, right? He's sure that, he just thinks that there's nothing about injustice or human nature or anything like that's the problem. Then he realizes that in truth and justice doesn't matter in Shawshank. He faces helplessness and isolation. But he uses after he hits that pit of despair, he starts using his intellect to help others. He makes a library at the Shawshank. He adds their books. He helps the guards with their finances. Over this whole time, he's developing a long-term plan. And then at the end, once again, totally worth a watch, even if you know every word of it. I watch it quite frequently over and over again. He escapes from tunnel to freedom. That is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Initial ignorance, we get to the peak of Mount Stupid, the valley of despair, the scope of enlightenment, and the plateau of sustainability.